43 years. That's how long I spent building Hargrove Auto and Body. Not a dealership, not a franchise, my shop. The one on Route 9 in Millbrook, New York, with the hand-painted sign my late wife Carol made the summer we opened. She used leftover barn red paint and a 2-inch brush, and she laughed the whole time because she kept spelling Hargrove with 2 R's. I still have that first sign in the back office. Never took it down. Carol passed 11 years ago. Breast cancer, stage 3, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. After she was gone, the shop was the only thing that kept me standing upright. I'd get there at 6 in the morning, sometimes 5:30, just to have somewhere to be. My guys knew. They didn't say anything about it. They just handed me coffee and we worked. I want you to understand what that place meant to me before I tell you what happened. Because if you don't understand that, none of the rest of it makes sense. My son Daniel is 41 years old. I raised him right here in Millbrook. He used to do his homework on the waiting room bench while I finished up jobs. He knew every tool by name before he was 10. I genuinely believed that someday the shop would be his. I pictured it, his name next to mine on the sign. Then he met Courtney. I want to be fair. Courtney isn't a bad person. She's just someone who grew up in a very different world than we did. Her family is from Greenwich, Connecticut. Her father runs a private equity firm. Her mother sits on the boards of 3 non-profits. They vacation in places I've only seen in magazines. When Daniel brought her home the first time, she looked around our kitchen and smiled in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. They got engaged 2 years after they started dating. I was happy for him. I told him that. I meant it. The trouble started small, the way it always does. Courtney wanted the wedding in the Hamptons. Fine. She wanted a venue that cost more per hour than I made in a week some months. Also fine. Daniel had money saved, and I offered to contribute what I could. What I had was about $40,000 set aside specifically because I always knew Daniel's wedding would come someday, and I wanted to be ready. What I didn't expect was the conversation about the rehearsal dinner. Courtney's mother, Patricia, called me directly. She explained, very politely, very warmly, that the Harrington family had certain traditions around rehearsal dinners, that it was customary for the groom's family to host, that the venue they had in mind was a restaurant in Southampton. She named it. I looked it up after we hung up. The minimum spend for a private dining room was $18,000. I told Patricia I'd do my best. I told Daniel the same thing. And then, over the next 6 months, I watched my son slowly become someone I didn't recognize. He stopped calling on Sundays. When we did talk, he sounded distracted, like he was half listening while someone else was in the room. He started using words like optics and positioning. He told me once, carefully, that Courtney's family was very image-conscious, and that it would mean a lot to him if I could maybe, and here he paused a long time, present myself a certain way at the family events. I asked him what he meant. He said Courtney's father had made a comment about my hands, about the grease under my fingernails that I never quite scrub out all the way, about how I'd shown up to their engagement dinner in khakis and a button down and her father had worn a blazer. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, Daniel, I've been a mechanic for 43 years. These hands put you through college. He said he knew that. He said he was proud of me. He said he was proud of me. He said he just wanted things to go smoothly. I let it go. You let things go when it's your kid. The wedding was on a Saturday in late September, one of those Hamptons days where the sky is so blue it almost looks fake and the air smells like salt and cut grass. The venue was a converted barn on a private estate. It cost more than my first house. I wore the suit Carol picked out for me years ago before she got sick. Navy blue, good wool. She said it made me look like a senator. I drove out there alone because Daniel had said the groomsmen were all getting ready together at the estate, and there wasn't really room for me in that plan. I told myself that was fine. The ceremony was beautiful. I sat in the front row and watched my son get married, and I cried the way fathers do, and I wasn't ashamed of it. The vows were real. Whatever else I can say about Courtney, she looked at my son like she loved him, and I held on to that. The reception was where it went wrong. I was at the bar getting a club soda. I've been sober for 16 years, another thing Carol helped me through. when Courtney's father, Richard, came to stand beside me. We made small talk for a few minutes. He asked about the shop, not with genuine interest, with the particular politeness of someone who is gathering information and doesn't want you to know it. Dow, he said he'd heard the property the shop sat on was worth quite a bit now that Route 9 had been rezoned for commercial development. He said a friend of his in real estate had mentioned it. He said casually, "The way you say things you've been waiting to say, that if I ever thought about retiring, he knew people who could help me maximize the asset." I said I wasn't thinking about retiring. He nodded and smiled and moved on. 20 minutes later, Daniel found me at my table. He crouched down beside my chair. He was nervous. I could tell by the way he was holding his jaw tight, the way he did as a kid when he'd broken something and was working up to telling me. He said, "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear me out before you react." I said, "Okay." He said Courtney's family felt that it might be better, just for the rest of the evening, for the photographs, for the formal dinner, if I sat at a table near the back, away from the Harrington family's main table. He said her grandmother was very traditional, and there had been some comments and Courtney was stressed, and he just wanted the night to go smoothly. I looked at my son for a long moment. "You're asking me to move to the back of the room at your wedding." He said it wasn't like that. I asked him what it was like then. He couldn't answer that. He just looked at the tablecloth. I want to tell you I stood up right then and gave some speech. I didn't. I sat there for probably 2 full minutes and I felt something go very quiet inside me. Then I folded my napkin, set it on the table, picked up my jacket from the back of the chair, and told Daniel I was going to head home. He didn't stop me. I drove back to Millbrook alone. 2 hours, mostly on the highway, and I didn't turn the radio on. I just drove. I thought about Carol. I thought about the first time I held Daniel in the hospital, this tiny, red-faced, furious thing, and I thought, I will do anything for this person. I thought about every Saturday I'd worked overtime so his school trips were paid for, every college application fee, every time I'd swallowed my own exhaustion because he needed something. I got home at 9:15. I changed out of the navy suit and hung it up carefully. I sat in the kitchen with a glass of water. At 9:47, my phone rang. It was Daniel, I answered. I thought maybe he was calling to apologize. He wasn't. He said, and I'm going to give you his exact words because I've replayed them enough times that they're permanent. He said, "Dad, we have a situation. The final invoices came in higher than we expected, and we're about 40,000 short. We need you to wire the money tonight or tomorrow morning, before the venue closes out the event." I said, "I'm sorry. Say that again." He said they needed $40,000, tonight or tomorrow. I asked him why he was calling me. He said, "Because you're my father, and this is an emergency." I sat there in my kitchen in Millbrook, and I thought about the hour, and about the drive home, and about the folded napkin, and about Richard asking me about the property value of my shop. I said, "Daniel, I left your wedding tonight because you asked me to sit in the back of the room like I was embarrassing you, and now you're calling me 4 hours later asking for $40,000. He said this wasn't the time to get into all that. I said, "I think it might be exactly the time." Then I said 4 words, simple, clear American words that any man who's ever been backed into a corner eventually learns to say. I said, "Speak to my lawyer." And I hung up. I didn't sleep much that night. Somewhere around 2 in the morning I got up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, and I started writing down everything I knew. The conversation with Richard about the property, the way it had been framed, not a suggestion, a probing question, the rehearsal dinner pressure, the gradual isolation from my son, the ask, on the night of the wedding, to move to the back of the room. It started to form a shape I recognized. I'd been in business for 43 years. I knew what it looked like when someone was sizing up an asset. I called my attorney Monday morning. His name is Frank DeLuca, and he's been handling my business affairs for 20 years. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, and when I was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Jim, do you have a will?" I did, but it was 15 years old. Carol was still in it. The shop was loosely designated to Daniel with no conditions. Frank said, "Let's update that. And let's also talk about a trust structure for the business property." Over the next 3 weeks, we put the shop and the land it sits on into a revocable living trust. We updated the estate documents. We made sure that the commercial property could not be transferred, sold, or leveraged without conditions that would take years to undo. It wasn't about cutting Daniel out. It was about making sure no one could use Daniel to get to what I'd spent my life building. During those 3 weeks, Daniel called twice. Both times he asked about the money. Both times I said Frank was handling my affairs and he should reach out to him. Both times he got frustrated and hung up. Courtney texted me once. She said she hoped I understood that this wasn't personal. I didn't respond. But I didn't know. What I found out later, through Frank, through a combination of public records and a quiet conversation with someone who knew the Harrington family's financial situation, was that Richard's fund had taken a significant hit in the previous 18 months. 2 major investments had collapsed. There was talk of a restructuring. He was land rich on paper, but liquidity poor in reality, and he had been, for some time, looking for a way to shore things up. The Route 9 property, my shop, on land I'd owned outright for 20 years, had been appraised by a developer at somewhere north of $2 million once the rezoning was formalized. Richard Harrington had apparently known about that appraisal before I did. Think about that for a moment. He knew what my property was worth, before I knew what my property was worth. And 6 months after Daniel started dating his daughter, the pressure on my son to change, to manage me, to keep me at arm's length from my own instincts, it had all begun. I don't know how much Courtney knew. I don't know if she was a participant or a bystander. I've thought about it a lot, and I still don't have a clean answer. What I know is that the wedding night phone call, $40,000, wire it tonight, had Richard Harrington's fingerprints all over it. That's not how young couples talk. That's not how newlyweds phrase things. That's the language of a man who's done deals his whole life and knows that the best moment to pressure someone is when they're already off balance. He'd sent my son to make the call, because a father might say yes to his son in a moment of weakness. He might not say yes to a near stranger who just had him moved to the back of a room. He almost knew me well enough. 4 months after the wedding, Daniel came to the shop. Not to the house, to the shop. He drove up on a Tuesday afternoon and sat in the waiting room for an hour before one of my guys came and told me he was there. I walked out with my work gloves still on. He looked tired. He'd lost some weight. His jaw was doing that thing again. He said, "I think I need to talk to you." I said, "I've been here the whole time." We sat in my office, the one with Carol's first sign hanging on the wall. He talked for a long time. He talked about the year he'd been having, about Courtney's family, about the financial pressure, about conversations he'd overheard between Richard and Courtney that he hadn't understood at first, and then understood too well. He talked about a night 3 months after the wedding when Courtney had told him, crying, that her father had been counting on certain things working out differently, that he'd expected a different outcome. Daniel said he'd asked her, what things, what outcome, and she hadn't answered him. He said he'd hired his own attorney 2 weeks before coming to see me. I listened to all of it. I didn't say I told you so. I didn't say anything about the phone call or the back of the room or the napkin I'd folded and set on the table. I just listened. When he was done, I took off my work gloves and set them on the desk. I said, "Are you okay?" He said he didn't know yet. I said, "That's an honest answer." We sat there for a while without talking, in the way that men who've known each other a long time can sit without it being uncomfortable. Then he looked at the sign on the wall, Carol's sign, the one with the crooked letters, and he said, "She would have known something was wrong a year before I figured it out." I said she would have known before he walked in the door. He almost smiled. The legal situation with Richard took another 8 months to fully resolve, if resolve is even the right word for something that just quietly deflates. There were some preliminary conversations through attorneys about the commercial property. There was a moment when Richard, apparently, floated the idea of a family investment partnership involving the Route 9 land as a contribution. Frank shut it down in one letter. Richard never called me directly. I respected him just enough for that, actually. He knew, I knew, and he didn't insult me by pretending otherwise. Daniel and Courtney separated 9 months after the wedding. She moved back to Greenwich. I don't know the full details, and it's not my business to know them. What Daniel told me is that they wanted different things, and that some of those differences had become clear to both of them in ways that couldn't be undone. He said it without bitterness, which surprised me. He said he thought they'd both been used in different ways by people who were managing a situation. He moved back to Millbrook. He's renting a place on Elm Street about 2 miles from the shop. He's been coming in on Saturday mornings. Not to work at first, just to drink coffee and watch. Then he started helping out on small things. Then one Saturday he showed up in work clothes and I handed him a socket set without saying anything, and he got under a 9 Silverado and didn't come back up for 2 hours. I haven't put his name on the sign yet, but I still have the extra barn red paint in the back of the shop. Carol bought 3 cans because she always said one was never enough for anything that mattered. I think about the night I drove home alone from that wedding sometimes. The dark highway and the radio off, and the particular silence of a man who's been told he's not worth keeping at the front of the room. I think about sitting in my kitchen and waiting for a call that I hoped would be one thing, and turned out to be another. I think about the 4 words I said and the sound of that call ending. People ask me sometimes what I would have done differently, if I would have pushed back sooner, said something harder, drawn a clearer line. I don't think so. I think I needed to let it play out the way it played out. I needed Daniel to get to the end of that road himself, because if I'd tried to drag him off it, he would have dug in harder. That's how he's always been. That's Carol in him, stubborn in the best way, until the evidence is so clear he can't argue with it anymore. What I know now that I didn't know when I was younger, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to move. Not threaten, not lecture, not explain yourself. Just stand still and let the other person run their course. The shop is still there. The sign is still there, hand-painted letters and all. The trust is structured so that it will stay in the family, under conditions that protect it, for as long as I'm alive and probably for decades after. And on Saturday mornings, my son comes in and we drink bad coffee and work on engines, and neither of us talks much, because neither of us needs to. Some things you rebuild slowly. Some things you just maintain. You show up, you do the work, you don't let anybody take what you spent your life making. Carol always said the difference between a man with integrity and a man without it is simple. One of them knows what he's willing to walk away from, and one of them knows what he's willing to walk away from, and one of them knows what he's not. I know which one I am. I always did. I've thought a lot about what actually happened that year. Not the events themselves, but the mechanics underneath them. How it started, why it ended the way it did. Richard didn't lose because he was unlucky. He lost because he built his plan on a foundation that only holds if the other person doesn't know their own worth. The moment I said, "Speak to my lawyer," and hung up that phone, the whole structure he'd been quietly assembling, the managed distance, the rehearsal dinner pressure, the wedding night call, it all stopped working. Not because I fought back hard, because I simply refused to move. That's the thing nobody tells you about people who operate the way Richard did. They're not actually that powerful. They depend entirely on your willingness to keep accommodating them. Every time Daniel came to me with another small ask, "Sit here, dress like this, don't say that," and I swallowed it, I was making a deposit into Richard's account. The night I walked out of that reception and drove home alone, I finally stopped making deposits. That's all it took. Daniel is harder to think about because I love him and because I understand exactly how it happened to him. He's not a weak person. He's someone who wanted something badly. A life that felt bigger than Millbrook. A marriage that worked. Approval from people who had a certain kind of standing. And he let that wanting make him manageable. Richard didn't manufacture Daniel's ambition. He just found it and used it. That's what shrewd people do. They don't create your weaknesses, they locate the ones already there. What I know about intelligence, Real intelligence, not the kind that scores well on tests, is that it's mostly just the willingness to keep looking at a situation honestly, even when what you see is uncomfortable. Daniel figured out what was happening. It took him longer than I would have liked, but he got there. He hired his own attorney. He came to the shop on a Tuesday afternoon and sat in the waiting room for an hour before he came in. That took something. Not just courage, honesty. He had to look at a year of his own choices and decide to see them clearly. That's harder than anything I did. I think about what it cost him to walk into that shop. I think about the weight of that, and I think the reason he could do it is because he knew, somewhere underneath everything, that I hadn't moved. I hadn't written him off. I hadn't locked the door. I just stood still and waited, the way you wait for something you believe in. 43 years of running a business teaches you that most problems are just people forgetting what actually matters. Money is real. Property is real. But the things that can't be appraised, the sign on the wall Carol painted with barn red paint, the sound of my son's voice when he finally stopped performing and just talked to me, those are the things worth protecting. And you protect them not by fighting, but by knowing, down to your bones, what you will not give away. I still have 3 cans of that barn red paint, some things you keep ready.